Okay, Alyssa, here's my attempt at skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are also known as striated muscles and voluntary muscles. Striated because of the stripes in the muscles, and voluntary muscles because you make your body do that. It's a voluntary motion. So, where in your body are the skeletal muscles? They're either attached to your bones or facial muscles are attached to your skin. The cell shape and appearance is important in a skeletal muscle. They're a single cell. They're very long, cylindrical, like the shape of a cigar, multinucleate. You can see the more than one nucleus per cell here, and the obvious striations, and we're going to find out the reason for that in a minute. So first, we're going to just look at the how a muscle is, what it's made of. All right, we're going to start at the teeny tiniest piece, and we're going to work our way out. So this very teeny tiny thing right here is a single muscle cell, muscle fiber also known as. And so this is surrounded by connective tissue, okay? And that's what this is pointing to right here. The connective tissue that's around a muscle fiber is called endomysium. And I remember N because it's N in the middle, okay? And then you have lots of these muscle fibers grouped together, and this group is called a fascicle. And then this fascicle is surrounded by a different connective tissue, and that is shown by this little guy, which is the paramecium. And then all these fascicles are surrounded by another layer of connective tissue, and that is the epimecium. Okay, so we go muscle fiber surrounded by endomysium, fascicle surrounded by paramecium, and then all the fascicles grouped together to make the big muscle surrounded by an epimecium. And I remember epi because epi is like close to the surface, like your epidermis. So it's the one furthest out. Okay, and then this is just a blood vessel. I don't think you have to know that. So all of these muscle fibers then come to an end in a tendon. And why do we have the tendon? We have the tendon because there's not enough room at joints for all these muscle fibers to cross over joints. And also, even though these muscle fibers are very strong, they're very fragile. So they would not be able to withstand the grinding between the bones at joints. So that's why we have a tendon there. That's also why there's so many layers of connective tissue because the muscle cells are so fragile. So I just answered that question. Why the connective tissue and why the tendon? And if a muscle does not end in a tendon, it ends in something called an aponeurosis, like these muscles in your back. You don't have tendons like you do, like your Achilles tendon to hook your gastrocnemius to your heel. You don't have those thick cords. You have these. It's more like a sheet of connective tissue. That's called an aponeurosis. Okay, so one of your other vocabulary words was fascia. So fascia is just another layer of connective tissue that would go around this whole thing. So you'd have the epimecium on the outside of the muscle, and then another layer of connective tissue around that, and that's the fascia. You can see that in this picture here. So why do we have skeletal muscles? They produce movement. It's usually voluntary, but you also use your skeletal muscles for reflexes. So sometimes it's involuntary, but most of the time voluntary. You use your skeletal muscles to maintain posture and body position. It's what lets you be able to sit in a chair. You use it to stabilize your joints. When I think of this, I always picture the deltoid, how it's such a big muscle and it covers your entire shoulder. It just keeps that joint in place. It's important in joints that are unstable, especially like your shoulder and your hip. You have a lot of those big muscles. Another function is generating heat. And then one that a lot of people forget is that protects fragile organs by enclosure. Think of your abdominal muscles. They're enclosing all of your guts to keep them safe. So now let's look at the microscopic anatomy of a skeletal muscle. So just to orient yourself, this is that drawing that we had before where this is the single muscle cell right here. Okay, so now this right here is the single muscle cell. So this and this are the same. You can see the multinuclei here, and then inside of your muscle cell, you have even smaller, they look like straws to me. So this straw is called a myofibril. Okay, this is the actual piece of the muscle that it's a contractile unit. So you have the all of these little guys are myofibrils. So now we're bringing this down here so we can see it a little bit closer. And this is where you can see the striations. So it makes it be colorful. So you have, let me go to the next slide. So I'm getting ahead of myself. This is the sarcolemma, which is just a fancy name for the plasma membrane. I don't know why that keeps popping up there, sorry, in a muscle cell. So sarcolemma is plasma membrane. The myofibril is this little bitty straw inside of the muscle cell. It's actually an organelle. They call it ribbon-like. I think it looks like a straw. Ribbon-like organelles in the cytoplasm of a muscle cell. So all of this cytoplasm is completely full of myofibrils. That's what makes the muscle cells so strong. So in your myofibril, okay, so back to this. In this myofibril, we have these little stripes. And these little stripes are actually I bands and A bands. So this little cross section right here got zoomed in right here. So we're looking even closer at these. So inside of your book, it tells you to remember that I bands are the light bands, and to remember that by light is Light. It has an I in it, so it's I bands. And the dark bands, DARK, have an A in them, so these are the A bands. So I bands and A bands. So from half of this I band to half of this I band and this A band are called a sarcomere. So from this Z disc to this Z disc, this is called a sarcomere, and this is the smallest contractile unit inside of a muscle. So inside of your sarcomeres, you have what are called myofilaments. So here's your sarcomere from Z disc to Z disc, and this are myofilaments. So this big fat one is myosin. I think of he's big, myosin. And actin is thin. If you're a very active person, you're thin. So the big, thick filaments are myosin. They're big. And the thin ones are actin because they're active. So they stay thin. Okay, so let's talk about myosin first. Myosin is made of a protein called myosin. That's why it's named that. And it also has ATPase enzymes, which are going to be important later when this muscle is actually contracting. So the myosin fills up the entire A band. That's what gives it its dark color, is this myosin filament. Okay, so another important thing is these myosin have these little projections that stick out they're going to form cross bridges later when the muscle's contracting with the actin. So these two they're going to use these cross bridges to pull this blue actin in. So you can see what that's done that here. That's how it's going to happen. I imagine it being like when you're on a zip line and you have to pull yourself in little by little, like in a rhythmic motion. That's kind of how this happens in a rhythmic way. It pulls that in all the way in until this is closed, and then that is the contractile unit fully contracted. So now let's talk about the actin. The actin is the thin filament. It's anchored to the Z disc. And as you can see, it's the only filament that you have in the I band. That's why it has a lighter color, because it's the thin filament here, and the A band has both and the thick filament, so it makes it look darker. It is important to know that the actin does not cross into this, they call it the bare zone, sometimes they call it the H zone, when it's at its resting state. So now this is that myofibril. Remember, that's the straw-like thing that was sticking out of the single muscle cell. So here we are, like this is the whole muscle cell again. And surrounding each one of those myofibrils, you have this sarcoplasmic reticulum. Um, and that's important because it's storing the calcium that we're going to need later for muscle contraction. You'll learn about that in the next section. So hopefully this was helpful to you. And if it was, we can do some more later.